In this video, we're going to look at serializers in Django REST Framework, and this is one of the most important things you need to know about the package. In the first video, we did the setup of the models that we have in this Django application. So if we look at models.py, we created these models in the first video in this series. We're now going to move on and look at Django REST Framework. And what we're going to look at in this video is the serializers. So we're going to come to that in a second. But I want to go to the installation section for REST Framework. And what we're going to do to start with is basically add REST Framework to our application. So you need to install it, of course, using pip or another tool like UV. And that should already be done in our project, because if you look at the requirements.txt file, that was specified in the starter code. So when you install those requirements into a Python virtual environment, it's going to install Django REST Framework. So now that we know it's installed, we can go to settings.py. And if we look at the installed app setting, we're going to add that right at the bottom here. So we're going to add REST Framework to installed apps, just as it says here in the documentation. So now that we have REST Framework in installed apps, what we're going to do is go back to our application. And within the API directory, that's the Django application, I'm going to create a new file here, and we're going to call this serializers.py. This is a file where we're going to store all of the serializers for this project. But before we start writing those, I want to go to the API guide, and I want to go to the documentation for serializers. Now let's see what these are according to the Django REST Framework docs. Serializers allow complex data such as query sets and model instances to be converted to native Python data types that can then be easily rendered into JSON, XML or other content types. And serializers also provide deserialization, so that allows the parsed data to be converted back into the complex types such as the Django models and the Django query sets. And that happens after first validating the incoming data. So basically with serializers, you can convert your Django models to JSON data, and that can include query sets of models. You can convert that all to a list of JSON data. And you can also take incoming JSON data and deserialize that into the complex data types such as Django models and query sets. Now serializers in REST Framework, they work similarly to Django's form and model form classes. So what Django REST Framework provides is a serializer class that gives you a powerful generic way to control the output of your responses, but it also provides a ModelSerializer class, which is a useful shortcut for creating serializers that deal with models, model instances and query sets. So let's move on to the section here. So what we have is an example of how to actually declare a serializer. So here we have one called 𝗏𝗏serializer, and you can see that it inherits from the REST Framework serializer class. And what you can add to your serializer are the fields that determine what is in the output of the response. For example, an email field. And just like Django models and forms, we have these fields that you can add to your serializer. For example, a serializers.email field, car field, and also a date time field here. So basically, imagine you want to get a list of comments. The serializer that we have here is going to determine what fields are present in the response based on the fields that we actually add to the serializer class. That's what's going to be converted from the Python data types into JSON data, and vice versa if you're deserializing some incoming data. Now what I want to do just now is go back to our application and go to models.py. We have a product model. Now imagine we wanted to convert that model or a query set of products into JSON data. That's what we're going to do in a second, and return some JSON data to the client. But in order to do that, we need a product serializer. So let's go to serializers.py, and at the top from REST_framework, we're going to import the serializers module. So import serializers, and because we're going to define serializers for all of our models, I'm going to import the three models that we are interested in here: the product, the order, and the order item. Now we can create a serializer class after we've imported those. So let's create one called product serializer. Now we're going to inherit from the serializers.ModelSerializer class. So we're going to inherit and extend that class, and that allows you to create an inner meta class, just like you do with Django model forms. So when you have a model serializer, you tie it to a model using the model property of the meta class. And because this is a product serializer, we're going to tie it to the product model. And then we specify the fields that we actually want to serialize to JSON. For example, if we're sending a response containing a list of products. Now we're going to pass a tuple here with all of the fields that we want to convert to JSON. So we want the product's name to be converted to JSON. So I'm going to add that as the first field here to this tuple. And let's add one field per line here. So name, and I also want to add description. And what have we got? Price as well. So we want the product's price to be present in the JSON response. And also, if we go back to models.py, we want to see whether or not the product has items in stock. So we're going to add the stock numbers as part of that response. Now, I'm not going to add the image field because they're all null at the moment. So we have 4 out of 5 of the fields present in the fields attribute of the meta class here on the product serializer. So what's going to happen here is that the model serializer is going to look at the model, and it's going to look at the types of each of these fields that we've added. So for example, the name is a car field, and the description is a text field, the price is a decimal field, and so on. And the serializer is smart enough to know which serializer field to use for each of these fields on the model. I'm going to go back to the documentation for now, and we're going to look at a page on serializer fields, and this will be linked in the description of the video. The fields handle conversion between the primitive values and internal data types, and they also deal with validating input values as well as retrieving and setting values from parent objects. So there are some arguments we're going to look at later in the series. You can add arguments, for example, to make a field read-only. And if a serializer field is read-only, they're going to be included in the API output, for example, in response to a GET request, but they're not going to be included in the input during create and update operations. And we also have a write-only field as well that does the opposite. So it's just getting used to this notion that a serializer class in Django REST Framework, it does two things essentially. It converts the complex models and query sets that you have in Django to JSON data, but it also can be responsible for incoming data, converting that JSON data that might be sent in the body of a post request to the complex objects, and that's the deserialization process. And what actually happens with the serializer depends on the endpoints that you have in your application, and it depends on the view classes that you're going to use. And we're going to see a lot of examples of that later on. Now at this stage, I want to show how to write a field level validation function on our serializer. So let's go back to the product serializer, and let's imagine that we want to allow clients to create a new product in the database using a post request. And we're going to see examples of that later in the series. Now the price field here, we don't want that to be less than or equal to 0, otherwise it doesn't have a price, and that doesn't make sense in the context of a product. So what we can do is we can actually write a validation function on the serializer, and that's going to make sure that when the data is sent, the serializer is going to attempt to convert that, but any validation that fails is going to prevent that conversion occurring, and you can then send the appropriate response back to your client. So let's write a function here, and I'm going to write a function called validatePrice, and that's going to take self and a value as the argument. Now let's explain this a little bit by going back to the documentation, and I'm going to go to the API guide and look at the page on serializers. At the left hand side you can see we have a section on validation, so I'm going to go to that just now, and we're going to cover the isValid function very soon. But if we go down here to field level validation on a serializer, as you can see, you can specify custom field level validation by adding a validate_fieldName method to the serializer class. And these are similar to the clean_fieldName methods that you find on Django form classes. So if you're familiar with those, it's the same concept, but it uses the validate_fieldName for the name of the function. And these methods, they take a single argument, and that's the value that requires validation. So you can see that in the documentation for this validateTitle method. And the title is a field on this serializer subclass, and that's a car field. And if we look at the validation function here, it's taking that value and it's lowercasing it here in the value.lower statement, and it's checking if that statement, or if that value rather, does not contain the word Django. And if Django's not in that, then it's going to return a validation error that the blog post is not about Django. So that's how you can write these validation functions on the field level on a serializer class. So let's go back here, and we're going to write our validatePrice function. All we need to do here is check if the value is less than or equal to 0. And if that's the case, what we can do is we can raise a serializers.validation error. And I'm going to pass a string in here that the price must be greater than 0. Otherwise, if there's no error in the value, in other words, if it's greater than 0, we can just return that value, and that's then going to be passed on to the next stage. And if all of your validation functions pass successfully and all of the field level validation works, then eventually Django REST Framework's serializer is going to convert that incoming data to the more complex objects, and then you can create models and query sets from that data. Now what I want to do now is we're going to write a Django view function that's actually going to use this product serializer. So let's go back to views.py within this application. We currently don't have any views from the starter code, but we're going to write a function-based view for now. But later on, we're going to see the power of Django REST Framework's class-based views, for example, generic views and view sets. But let's start simple here. We're going to look at function-based views, and we're going to look at how to actually work directly with the serializer classes. Now I'm going to remove the import at the top, and I'm going to bring in 3 imports here. First of all, we're going to import the JSON response from Django, and we're going to import the product serializer that we just created, as well as the product model class. Then we're going to create a view function here called product list. So let's imagine that we have these products in the database, and we want to return a JSON response with all of the products converted from those database objects into JSON data. So a Django view will take the request as the first parameter, and then we're going to fetch all of the products from the database, and we can do that with an ORM query, and that's product.objects.all. Once we have all of the products, what we can do is create the serializer. So I'm going to create a serializer variable here, and we can instantiate the product serializer. Once we instantiate that, we can pass to it a list of the objects that we want to actually convert from objects to JSON data. So what I'm going to pass in here is the query set of all of the products. And because that's more than a single object, we can pass, or we have to pass, many equals true as a keyword argument. So if you're serializing a single Django model instead of a list of products, then you don't need to pass many equals true. But if you have more than one model, in other words, if you have a query set, you need to pass many equals true here in order to convert that to JSON data. Now the final thing to do here in this Django view is actually to return an HTTP response. We're going to return a JSON response here, and what we can pass in here is a dictionary of data, and that's going to be represented in the JSON data. So I'm going to create a key called data, and what we can do to access the serialized data representing these products is we can take the serializer and get the .data attribute. And this attribute has the serialized representation of the products. So we can add that there, and we can then return the JSON response. So now that we have the Django view function, we can go to urls.py, and what we're going to do here is add a path. And because we're getting a list of products from the database, the REST API convention is to have a URL/products to represent that resource that we're getting back in the API. So /products, when we send a GET request to that URL, we want to get back a list of all of the products in the database. And the view that we're going to call here is the product list view that we just created, and we can now save urls.py. So now that we have this, what I'm going to do is bring up the terminal, and inside the Python virtual environment, we can run the Django development server. And once that's running, we can go to the browser, and we're going to send a request to localhost 8000/products. So let's go to the browser just now. And when we send that request to this endpoint, you can see we get back a key here called data in the response, in the JSON response, and that maps to a list of products. And each product has the keys that we specified in the Django REST Framework serializer. So we can see the name, description, the price, and the value of the number in stock. And if we wanted to change this, for example, to remove the description that we have here, we can simply go into serializers.py, we can target the fields on this model serializer, and we can just remove the description field here and save this. And then if we go back to the browser and refresh the page, it's going to send a new request, and the response this time, based on the serializer's fields, is not going to contain that description. So it's very easy to create a serializer and tie it to a model using this ModelSerializer class, and then determine which fields should be present in the responses. And you can also determine if it's an incoming request to create new data or update data, which fields you actually want to be present in that incoming response. So that is very flexible, and Django REST Framework makes it very easy to create these serializer classes. And we're going to see later on that we don't even need to do this kind of work here, because some of the views that are provided by REST Framework are going to handle all of this code here for the serializers automatically. Now, even though that works automatically, I did want to include a section on the serializers and how you can pass query sets and models into the serializer and get the serialized data here. I think it's important to know a little bit about how it works behind the scenes, and that's what we're doing here. We're taking the product serializer, we're passing in a query set, and because it's a query set, we pass in many equals true, and then we're returning directly a JSON response in Django with the data that's been serialized as part of that response. Now, one thing to note here is that Django REST Framework actually comes with a request and response object And these objects augment the existing Django request and response objects. So let's go back to the REST Framework documentation, and I'm going to go to the API guide, and we're going to look at the responses here. So as it says here, REST Framework supports HTTP content negotiation by providing a response class that allows you to return content that can be rendered into multiple content types, depending on the client request. And the REST Framework response class is subclassing this simple template response from Django. Now, using the response class, it provides a nicer interface for these content negotiated web API responses. Now, what does that actually mean? Let's go down to the section on creating responses. So unlike the regular HTTP response in Django, you don't instantiate response objects with rendered content. Instead, you pass in unrendered data, which may consist of Python primitives. Now, if you look at the signature for the response, it takes data as an argument. So what we're going to do here is just go back to our view that we've got here. And at the top, I want to import the response object from Django REST Framework. So from REST Framework.response, we're going to import that response object. And I also want to import a decorator here called API view. Now, before we add these to the code, again, I'm going to go back to the documentation, and I'm going to go to a section on function-based views. So if we go to the API guide here and go to the page on views, there is a section here on function-based views, and we're going to see how to apply a function-based view in Django REST Framework. Now, later on in the series, we're going to use exclusively class-based views because they are very flexible, and there's also better support for things like throttling and caching and filtering and so on. But what we're going to do just now is we're going to look at the functional approach. Now, what we can do is decorate our function with the API view decorator. So let's do that just now. And I'm going to decorate product list with API view. And we can actually pass some methods into that, as you can see here. So I'm going to pass a list of HTTP methods that are valid for this particular view. And we only want to allow a GET request in order to return a list of data. So HTTP GET requests are going to get back data from your backend, from the server. So we're going to limit to GET requests here using API view decorator and passing GET in as an argument. Now, once we've got that, we can change the JSON response. And what we're going to do instead is we're going to return a Django REST Framework response object. And that's going to perform that automatic content negotiation that was mentioned in the documentation. And we're going to pass serializer.data into that. And remember, if we look at the response object, it's going to expect that data that we're going to send back as part of the response. So we're sending back the data that's been serialized here. So let's now save this and go back to our API here. And when we refresh this, you can see we get back a different type of response. It looks a lot better in this view. And this is called the Django REST Framework Browsable API. So one of the benefits of using some of these primitives from REST Framework instead of just the JSON response is that we can access the browsable API, as you can see here. And that provides options, for example, to convert to different HTTP methods. And we only have a GET request for this endpoint, but if the endpoint accepted a POST request, you could also see a form on the page that would allow you to send data to the endpoint. So the Browsable API, it provides human-friendly HTML output for each resource when the HTML format is requested. What I'm going to do is load another page in the Django REST Framework documentation. So I'm going to go to a section on the Browsable API, and that's under the topics header at the top. And if we go down to the formats section here, by default, the API is going to return the format that's specified by the headers, which in the case of the browser is HTML. But what we can do is we can add a format keyword argument to the URL in the request. And you can look at the raw JSON response in the browser by adding format equals JSON as a keyword argument. So let's go back to the URL at the top here. And what we're going to do is add that format equals JSON argument, and we get back the initial representation of the data. So we can change the type of data that's requested here just by adding that format parameter to the URL. Now this output is controlled by something called renderers in Django REST Framework. So if we go back one more time to the documentation, I'm going to go to the API guide here, and there's a section on renderers. So REST Framework includes a number of built-in renderer classes, and these allow you to return responses with various media types. Now the one that we're using for HTML is this Browsable API renderer, and that's going to render the data into HTML for the Browsable API, as you can see here on this page. And when we add the format and set that to JSON in the URL, we are getting back a different response, and that's based on the JSON renderer. Now, typically in a web API, you're going to return JSON data, and you might also return the HTML format if you're doing some development and debugging. But there's actually quite a lot of these renderers available, as you can see on the left hand side. We have some for HTML forms and also multi-part renderer. And if we click that, this is used for HTML multi-part form data. And that's useful if you're uploading files to your API. This is one of the renderers that can be used for that. Now, if we go down to the bottom here, we have some third-party packages for rendering in different formats. For example, YAML, XML, JSON-P, and we also even have renderers for pandas and for LaTeX. Now, in this course, we're going to stick to the basic renderers, and that's JSON and the Browsable API renderer. But this is just to touch upon the fact that these exist in Django REST Framework, but it's not something that we're going to have to worry about too much in this series. Now, I want to finish this video with an example of how to serialize a single item based on a parameter in the URL. So you can see at the moment we have a GET request to /products, and that's going to return all of the products converted to JSON in the response data. So that's working with a query set of objects. If we go back to views.py, the query set that we're pulling out here on line 10, and that's product.objects.all. Now imagine we wanted to get a response for a single product based on its primary key. So if we go back to the response here, the first product here is the book A Scanner Darkly, and that has an ID associated with it. Now we can view that ID by going back to serializers.py, and we're going to add the ID as part of the data that we want to convert to JSON. So let's add the ID, which remember is an implicit field on the Django model. So unless you exclusively add a primary key to the model, it's going to add the ID by default. When we refresh this, you can see we get back the ID for each of those products. So what I want to do is go to the URL and go to /products/1, and I want to get back the response for that particular product and not the query set containing all of the products. But at the moment, we don't have a URL for this, so that's returning page not found and 404. So what we're going to do is add a URL for this. So let's go back to urls.py, and I'm going to add another path below the one that we have, and that's going to contain a path parameter for the primary key of the product. Now, instead of a list view, this is going to load up a view called product detail that we're going to create just now. So let's save this and go back to views.py. And what I'm going to do is just copy this view that we have just now, and I'm going to paste that below here. And we're going to change the name of the view to product detail. Now, because we're adding a path parameter here called pk, what we need to do in order to accept that in the Django view function is add the pk parameter here, and then we can use that primary key from the URL within the logic of this function. So instead of looking up an object here, or rather instead of looking up all objects, I'm going to remove this line of code, and we're going to get back a single object by calling getObject or 404, which is a function from Django's shortcuts module. So let's go to the top here, and I'm going to remove this JSON response from Django.shortcuts. Let's import getObject or 404, and then let's go back down to our function. So we're getting a product here, and we need to do the lookup. So it's going to be on the product model, and we want to look up by the primary key. So getObject or 404, the signature of this function is to take the model that you want to look up, and then the lookup parameters come after that. So in this case, it's just the primary key, and we want to get back a product from the database based on that primary key. Now, once we have a product, that's going to be a Django model. It's not going to be a query set of models. So we're going to pass that product into the product serializer to convert it from a Django model to JSON data. And because it's a single object, we don't need many equals true. So once we've changed this up, and we now have this view function that fetches a single instance from the database, a single row, and then serializes that by passing it into our product serializer, we can now save this and go back to the browser. And this page where we got a 404 before, we're going to refresh this. And this time you can see we have the data coming back, the JSON data for that product. And if we change the URL from 1 to /2, we get back the data for the second product, which is this coffee machine. So that's going to be all for this video. We've created two function-based views, and we've added Django REST Framework serializers to convert our product data to JSON. And we saw a custom way that we can use these serializers by passing the model or the query set into the serializer and then getting the data and returning that as a REST Framework response. And we've decorated these functions with the REST Framework API view. What I want to do in the next video is I want to look at nested serializers, and that's going to look at the relations that we have between some of these models. For example, if we look at the order model that has a foreign key to the user model, we want to represent that in a nested relationship so that when we look at the JSON data, we can see which user is attached to an order. We're going to look at nested serializers in the next video, But thank you for watching this video. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. And if you want to support the channel, check out our Ko-fi page in the description. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.